Hello, boys and girls. Welcome to our first science lesson of this new Learning from Home block. Now, I have a bit of a revision lesson for you guys today. We did have some science lessons during our last week, but a lot of students were away and we had only about half our students there. So I want to go over what we did in our last lessons and then wrap up this part that we've been doing on our microorganisms. Now, what I'm going to show you guys first is exactly what we did last lesson, and that was we actually began an experiment. Okay, and the experiment was to test to see what would happen when we mixed water, sugar, and yeast in different ways. Okay, now on the screen here now you can see I've got the sheet that we actually used in our last lessons. This will be familiar to some of you. But what we actually did in this last lesson is we took a look at these instructions and set up 4 different bottles. You can see these 4 different bottles here, okay? One bottle we put water and yeast in. Another bottle we put water, yeast, and sugar. Then another bottle we put water and sugar, and then another one with yeast and sugar. So what we were trying to determine is exactly what yeast needs or what happens in order to make yeast effective. Because you might remember in our earlier lessons where we tasted all the bread, we found that only bread with yeast in it had risen. Anything else didn't rise and they were just flat breads. Okay, so right, we've established that yeast makes the bread rise, but exactly what conditions does it need for that to happen? Okay, so what we did is we mixed these things together just like in these 4 different bottles, and then we put them underneath the air conditioner just with the heater on, just because it needed to be in a warm place. Now I have a little picture of the results of that. Where is it? Okay, yes, here it is. Okay, this was the end of the day. Okay, so this was after about probably 3 or 4 hours later. Than our classes. This is what happened. You can see these ones on the right here. These were just the water and yeast, and you can see they did not rise. There was a little bit of air in those balloons, but that was just the same air that was already in there when we put the balloon on the top. So nothing changed. So when water and yeast was mixed together, it didn't make anything rise. It didn't make any more gas. Nothing happened. Okay, now this one here, there's 2 of these ones here, this one and the one behind it. This was actually sugar and yeast. Now, interestingly enough, the one behind it, it didn't rise, but this one in front did actually rise a little bit. You can see it's blown up this balloon a little bit. And the actual reason for that was because there was a little bit of water in this water bottle, just some drops at the bottom, which actually still was enough to give some of that yeast a drink. So this one actually did rise a little bit, but if we'd had that bottle completely dry, it wouldn't have risen at all. Okay? This one here is just sugar and water, and as expected, nothing happened. Sugar and water doesn't make any gas, doesn't make the balloons go up at all. Nothing happened and changed with these ones. And these ones here on the left, we had a few of them. These were the ones with all of those things in it. So we had sugar, water, and yeast in those bottles. And you can see these ones have blown up quite a fair bit, and they continue to blow up even more after this. Okay? Now, what we learned from this experiment was that basically the yeast needs all of these things in order to start activating and working. Okay? It needs water, like all living things need water, so it needs water, and it needed food. Now, what was the food for the yeast? That was the sugar. Okay? So that's why this yeast and water, it had a drink, but it had no food in there. There was no sugar, no food, so it didn't activate, it didn't grow. But this one had the food, so the yeast sort of eats the sugar, and in the water, it's got the water to keep it alive, and it needs that drink. And in that process, it actually starts growing and multiplying, and more yeast starts growing. And as the yeast begins to grow, it makes a gas. And the gas it actually makes is carbon dioxide. Okay, and the carbon dioxide then is filled up these balloons above them, so they've quite strong pressure inside those. And that's why when we get bread that is fluffy, we saw those bubbles in it, like a sponge. All these lots of little bubbles, because each of the yeast there actually got a little bit of water, because when we make bread, it's mixed with a bit of water. Okay, and it has sugar. There is naturally a bit of sugar in the wheat, and then it eats the sugar, has the water and makes little bubbles all throughout the bread, and that's what makes it so fluffy and spongy, the whole piece of bread. So we can see here in this little experiment, we have completely proved that yeast needs both sugar and water with yeast for it to be effective and activated. Now, that is why actually some breads put a bit of sugar in them, but there is actually enough sugar just in wheat naturally. So you can do it without actually adding extra sugar. But that is why it happens. Okay, so yeah, this worked quite well. I know some of you have seen this, but most of you have not. So this was the results, and we have there our proof. Now, there's one other thing that these things needed to actually work. Okay, we had food and water, food being the sugar, water, obviously, but they also need warmth. It's just like us, even ourselves. To live, we need food, we need water, but we also need to stay warm. If we get too cold, well, we die. We need warmth to function. That's why we have warm clothing. That's why we live in houses to keep us warm. That's why in the caveman days we would huddle around a fire in a cave, because without enough warmth we wouldn't survive. And yeast is the same. So I actually had the heater just blowing gently on these just to keep it gently warm, because it was a fairly cold day. It doesn't need to actually cook. It's just like warmish. It was probably about just 25 degrees or so. Okay, but you could even go a bit warmer than that. All right, and so with those three things, our experiment was a success, and we proved that the yeast did actually activate and work. Now, interestingly enough, how the yeast actually does this is that when the yeast eats, because remember, yeast is a microorganisms, they're small living things, okay? When it eats, it actually does what yeast call is budding. And I'm going to show you a video in a second where you can actually see the budding. But as yeast eats, it starts to grow another yeast, because yeast they don't have babies like other animals do. They just sort of, another yeast starts to grow off the side of it. And then when it's big enough, it splits off, and then you have two yeast. And then those yeast grow other little yeast off the side of them too. And as they grow, a byproduct of that is the carbon dioxide gas, which makes our bread fluffy and our balloons blow up. Okay, so in here, it's we couldn't actually breathe that, it's carbon dioxide, but it does blow up the balloon. All right, so what I'm going to do now is, so that was that experiment there. Now I'm just going to switch over to our Google Classroom. Now, this is the Google Classroom. It's a specialist class. You guys have obviously found that if you're watching this video. But the Indonesian and my science things are in here. Possibly even Mr. Fish will make some posts. But they'll all be here, so you can check those out. And just check this each specialist day, and we'll have our work here for you guys. All right. But inside here, in this PowerPoint that you're using now, here it is here. This week 6. No, this isn't week 6 now. This is week 5. Okay. Week 5. You're watching this video, and afterwards I have some questions for you guys to look at. Okay, I won't need those ones there. All right. Okay, so the first question you're looking at is, what does it mean to say yeast is a microorganism? So I actually want you to write your answers in here. Okay. Now, this is basically just a check to make sure you understand it. You are allowed to look up some answers if you can't remember, but it's just like saying, when I say yeast is a microorganism, what do I mean? Write something down here. You can even add a picture if you'd like. Okay, next, is yeast a living thing? Okay, you can't just say yes or no. You need how do you know? What proof can you give me to prove that yeast is a living thing. Okay, even in that experiment we just did, we can actually lend some proof to that argument. Okay, after that, what conditions does yeast need to be active and make carbon dioxide gas? So yeast, when it's in bread or in those bottles, it made carbon dioxide. What conditions did it need for that to happen? So what does it need? And we talked about that, and it's also at the end of the little video I'm going to show you. And last of all, give an example of bread with yeast and bread without yeast. Include some pictures, just so you can link that back to our first lesson and make sure you understand everything. Now, what I'm going to do for you guys now is I'm going to show you guys a video. Now, this is actually a video made in England, so I apologize for the accents, but this is actually a bread making video. Now, because we're doing home learning, I can't actually make bread with you guys in the class or anything like that. I'm sure some of you guys have actually probably done this at home before, or your parents have showed you or could do it with you. But this is just a video of some students making some bread with this particular focus on yeast as a microorganism. Okay, so with a particular focus of yeast being a living creature that we add to bread to make it grow and get that carbon dioxide bubbles all throughout it to make it nice and fluffy. So I want you to watch the whole video, watch carefully, and at the end of it, you'll be able to answer all of those questions, and it should all make sense. Next week, we're going to move away from yeast onto a new part of this microorganisms, but we just wanted to wrap this up now so that we are all on the same page. All right, thank you, boys and girls. I'm going to play that video for you guys now. Have a great time, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye.
Today what we're going to do is we're going to make some bread. The first thing that we do is we need some flour. Now flour is the main ingredient in our bread. We are then going to add a whole teaspoon of sugar, and I'm going to add to this warm water. Okay, so I've got mine in my jug here, and I've got some measured out for you as well. And the very last thing that we need is really important. Okay, it's something called yeast. Do you guys know what yeast is?
It's what makes the bread rise.
Why does it help to make bread rise in the first place?
It makes the gas go in.
It makes a gas, that's right. And what is it? Is it a chemical thing?
It's a living thing.
It's a living thing, that's right. Is it a big living thing or is it a small living thing?
Tiny. Small.
It's really tiny. So yeast is a really tiny living thing. Here, I'm having a little look at some yeast down the microscope. What I've done is I've coloured them with some green so that we can see them nice and clearly. We need to use a microscope to be able to see them because yeast are a microorganism, or microbe for short. They're really tiny living things. Like all living things, yeast need food, water and warmth to grow. In this animation, you can see that yeast grow by budding. Each mother cell grows and produces new yeast cells over and over again. We add it to our bread because when yeast grows, it produces a gas. That gas is called carbon dioxide, and that gas gets trapped in the flour, it gets trapped in the bread dough, and we're going to put it in to make our bread nice and fluffy and bubbly. What would happen if we didn't add yeast to the bread?
It wouldn't rise.
It wouldn't rise. So I'm going to get you guys to make some bread, and I'm going to make some bread. I'm not going to bother putting yeast in. We'll use that as a little controller, a little tester for our experiment. And the bread that you make, we'll make sure that we remember to put the yeast in it. So let's put in a teaspoon of yeast into our bowl as well. That's brilliant. The sugar that we're adding is the food for the yeast. There's a cup and a half of water here. Pour it all in. The reason that we use warm water is because the yeast like it when it's a bit warm.
Oh, that's nice, actually.
Slow down. Pour it in, and I'm going to get you to get your dough just like the boys and mix it in. Mix it all in. for me. Just get your hands right in there. It's messy and it's gooey. Just get your hands in. How about we go and knead our bread over on the other surface? Would that be all right? Boys, do you want to come over and we'll get ready to start kneading as well? Right. Still feeling very sticky?
Yeah.
And we want our dough to be quite elasticy because when the yeast starts to produce the gas, then the gas gets stuck in the little bubbly pockets, and we want those pockets to be quite stretchy. Oh, well done. Keep going. So once you've got them rolled into big sausage shapes for me, I'll get you to put them inside the loaf tins. Alright, stick them into the tins. And what I'll do is I'll go and put them somewhere nice and warm and let them double in size once they grow. So we'll put them with our tin that's got the one without the yeast in it, and we'll leave them for a little while to see if they double in size, because when yeast grows it produces a gas. That gas is called carbon dioxide, and that gas gets trapped. It gets trapped in the bread dough. So we've left these somewhere nice and warm for about an hour now. What's happened to them?
These two have risen. Because they've got the yeast in.
These ones have got the yeast in and this one doesn't.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do is we're going to bake them in the oven now and see what happens then. Yeah, we can maybe eat them at the end. So put the last one in. There we go. And we'll come back and see them in about 25 minutes. We should have some nice bread. Hi. Hello, how you doing?
Good.
You alright?
Yeah.
Okay. Should we have a little look and see how our bread's gotten on in the oven?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, right. I'll go and take it out. Go. Okay, so will we have a little look to see which ones look the nicest inside? Yeah. How about, well, I'll just break them open. Would that be nice? Yeah, instead of slicing. Alright, so. Oh my goodness, look at this.
Nice and crisp.
Well, it's
Nice.
boiling.
Oh, it's very hot,
That looks delicious.
but it's got this lovely, lovely fluffiness to it, because when yeast grows, it produces a gas. That gas is called carbon dioxide, and that gas gets trapped. It gets trapped in the bread dough. And this one?
Yeah.
It's very hot. Oh my goodness.
So
Oh,
much green.
That's-
Doesn't have much pocket
it doesn't have much pocket. Why is that?
because
It's not-
it doesn't have any
It
yeast.
doesn't have any yeast in it. It doesn't smell that nice actually as well, which is interesting. That one smells sort of yeasty. Would any of you like a little bit of butter on it?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Oh my god, it's delicious.
There we go.
Thank you.
That's maybe a bit much.
It's nice and crisp.